It is a pleasure to be here with you this morning. I'm glad that we have a room full of men, a couple of ladies that are here, but it's great to come to lectureships like this for no other reason than the fact that your family appreciates you more when you're away from home. Some of you may have heard my little story on Sunday afternoon. My kids were on their way back to Frieda Hardeman, and they went separately, and my daughter called me, and she was traveling from Atlanta up toward Frieda Hardeman in her car, and she called me and she said, "Dad, I just crossed the South Carolina line." Now, that doesn't perhaps mean a whole lot to you this morning, but it'd be kind of like if you had a daughter who was going to Abilene Christian and she called you and told you, "I just crossed over into Arkansas." And so I had a little bit of a difficulty trying to work her way back to Atlanta and then back on the interstate, and then finally, we got her over to Huntsville that night where my mom and dad live, and got her spending the night there and then getting up and starting on with that travel over there. But they appreciate me more when I'm away, so it's kind of nice. I do appreciate Brother Boren mentioning to you about the restorationmovement.com. I would like to encourage you to look at that site and utilize it. I really do believe that we need to remember our past, because I believe that if we don't learn from the mistakes of our past, we're doomed to repeat them. And certainly many mistakes have taken place in the Restoration Movement. The men of that movement have not been perfect men, but they have been great leaders, and they've done great things for God. And they deserve to be remembered. And I know that I heard a list of names that Jeff mentioned a few moments ago of great gospel preachers, but someday people will not have heard of Gus Nichols, and some people will not have heard of other great gospel preachers. And so we need to remember what they did and appreciate what they did, and be reminded by their example and faithfulness in life of how important it is to be faithful and endure to the end. Because at the end, God's got a great big plan for us. He's got a great big blessing that He wants to bestow on His children. And so we need to look forward to that and look forward to that time. I want to encourage you young preachers in the School of Preaching to take the classes on restoration history with a renewed interest at the amount of information and appreciate the amount of work that's been done before you got there. And I think that we need to raise up and be thankful for the bridges that we've crossed. And I hope that you will do that. I don't know what you do in your restoration studies, but something I do, and when I teach restoration history at the School of Preaching in Georgia, is I like to take my students on trips around different areas and show them different places. Now, I arrived here on Thursday and had the joy of being able to go and visit some of the graves of some great gospel preachers. And there are many gospel preachers who lived and died in this area who did some great things. I think our young men need to go down to Adrand College down in Thorpe Spring. They need to see what took place down there. And I'll tell you, one of the greatest pictures to take is the picture of the Church of Christ sign just across the street from the old ruins of the Adrand College, and be able to see those ruins in the background and appreciate that some men like Brother Clark stood up and said what he needed to say and did what he should do, and even though it was the hardest thing in the world he ever did, and he walked out of that old church there when they brought the instrument in, we need to remember him. We need to visit Brother Clark's grave in that old cemetery there at Thorpe Spring. And then there are the J.D. Tants at Cleburne, and Brother R.L. Whiteside at Denton, and Brother Batzel Baxter just south of Sherman, and so many other great men, C.M. Pullius right here in the Dallas area that are buried here. And the great work that was done. Go down and see the grave of Anthony Bledsoe down in Lancaster, who moved from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and settled just south of Dallas and started a new town, just named it after the town that he came from. But not only did he name the little town, but he planted the gospel here. and great work was done. So there's a lot to see in this area. I hope that you will plug into that. Of course, I didn't come in here to just talk about that, but I could spend the rest of my time talking about restoration history. It's a great blessing to me. But I want us to spend some time talking about Sampson, because there's so many things about his life that help us to really identify with who we are. When you think about Sampson, you think about almost like a cartoon character. You think about Superman or Batman or somebody like that's just beyond life. He just had some great strength and great power and did some great things, and he's just one of the most colorful stories for young people and really for old people alike, because there's something about Sampson that kind of gives you a glimmer of hope. Maybe a little righteous justice, or maybe some strength where wrongs can be righted even in our own lifetime. But, of course, we also, when we think about Sampson, we think about his failures and we think about his mistakes. I want to spend a few moments thinking about some of the very special things about his life that teach us about how we can live our lives better. But I think that in introducing this subject, I think it's good for us to start not just in chapter 13 where we introduced his life, but look back in chapter 2 there. Look at something that was introduced there in verse 1. The angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I led you up from the Egypt and brought you to the land of which I swore to your fathers. And I said, listen to it, I will never break my covenant with you. I will never break my covenant with you. Now, those are some big words to be said by God to a group of people who were so hopelessly, helplessly caught up in their own self-experience, in their own self-trust, in their own self-reliance. God made a commitment. He said, I'm going to stay with you no matter what. Because, you see, I made some promises in olden times. Remember Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, when God had said to Satan, and hence also to Adam and Eve, that he was going to do something about man's sin problem. He says, I will put enmity between thee and the woman, between thy seed and her seed. He shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. And later that renewed promise to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3, and later also to Isaac and to Jacob, that God was going to bring about some great things through the seed of Abraham. God was committed to His promises. He was committed to His people so that they would be able to bring about the promises that God had intended for mankind, even if they were not going to do their part. God was going to do His part. But along the way, He was going to teach them some valuable lessons about life and about who they were. I think if you flip over in chapter 13 and begin to look at the life of Sampson, the first thing you see is God giving us an idea about how He's going to take care of Israel, even though Israel is lost in what I would like to call an identity crisis. They don't really know who they are. They had been, time and time again, in captivity. 40 years on this occasion they were in captivity. And it's amazing how God, time and time and time again, just as Jeff mentioned before, had raised up these deliverers, and yet the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. Some 7 times, I think it's mentioned in the text, that they did evil in the sight of the Lord, and so God sells them off into into oppression by those nations that are around. But God's there, and God remembers, and we'll talk about remembrance as the time draws nearer to the end. But they're going through an identity crisis, and I think there's so much rich symbolism here that I think it's important for us to see. I think it's interesting the fact that, Manoah, his father, is identified, but his mother's not. And I think maybe we could see some comparison in the identity or the lack of identity in the name of Samson's mother to maybe portray somewhat where Israel truly was. Listen, verse 2, he says, "Now there's a certain man from Zoar, the family of the Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren and had no children." Not only do we not hear her name, but her purpose is also absent. We don't hear that she has children. For many in ancient times, and I guess even today, women feel so much purpose in life through childbearing. But the fact that the woman's name's not even mentioned, and the fact that she doesn't even have her purpose set in order, gives us an idea that maybe we're identifying something about Israel itself and how disconnected they are. What's the importance of a name? It's interesting that the angel of the Lord comes along and tells her she's going to conceive and have a son, but in verse 6, he doesn't tell her his name. In fact, look what the woman did. It said, "The woman called her husband, saying, 'A man of God come to me, and his countenance was like the countenance of the angel of God, very awesome, and I did not ask him where he was from, and he did not tell me his name.'" That's interesting. Look up later in verse 17, when Manoah finally meets the angel of the Lord, he asks the question, "What is your name?" See, the name is such an important thing to a person that when your words come to pass, we may honor you. And the angel of the Lord said to him, "Why do you ask my name, seeing that it is wonderful?" Now, I did a little study on the word wonderful there, and apparently the word wonderful comes from the root idea of being separate or surpassing. Perhaps even trying to get the point across, my name is beyond your comprehension. It's beyond your understanding. Where was Israel at this time? 40 years separated from God, being oppressed by the nations around, by the Philistines? Don't you think they're going through an identity crisis? Who am I? What is my purpose in life? What am I here for? Perhaps we need to hear, first of all, is the fact that God is trying to help them to see that they had lost their identity of who they were and what their purpose was. God called Israel, as it were, with a grand purpose, that they were going to be somewhat of an envelope type thing that God was going to utilize, through which He was going to bring about His wonderful plan of redemption, salvation, forgiveness of sin. God had some great work and great plan of purpose when He brought Sampson into this world. Sampson had a purpose. And his purpose was going to be bound up in what he did. And we might even go as far as to say that his identity of who he was going to be bound up in what he did. Look at verse 12. Manoah said, "Now let your words come to pass. What will be the boy's rule of life and his work?" What's going to be his work? What's going to be his purpose? What will people remember him by? What will people know him by? Israel was going through an identity crisis. In much the same way, I believe Christians today are going through an identity crisis. Brother Jeff mentioned a few moments ago some of the examples of things that are going on in our brotherhood where it just seems like we're unleashed. The gloves are off and we're just going out there because we don't know who we are. We've forgotten who we are. The head of restoration studies at ACU in this month's edition of Discipliniana is a publication that is produced by the Disciples of Christ Historical Society. This is a man who is a member of the Church of Christ, a preacher. And he wrote a very, very long and extensive article to try to look at things that were said, quotes that were made by restoration figures of yesteryear concerning his belief that they really didn't see that there was anything different between them and any other denomination. And so he uses quotes from Alexander Campbell and Barton Stone and other great leaders as proof that really we don't need to see that we're a unique people. We need to see that we're all part of this great big Christian umbrella concept where we're no different than anybody else who names the name of Christ, because we raise the hands of our restoration leaders and say, well, they didn't look down their nose at their fellow man who were not of their faith. Well, I want to tell you this morning, Alexander Campbell did some great things, but Alexander Campbell wasn't a perfect man. And Barton Stone did some great things, but Barton Stone was not a perfect man. I appreciate what they did do, but I know that they had some mistakes. And another thing is that we need to note and understand is, these men were in a process of trying to come out. And they were trying to leave the shackles of denominational blindness and put on the robes of righteousness and truth and the simplicity, as it's been pointed out so greatly in our discussions this week, of the gospel. Oh yeah, they made some mistakes and they said some things that later I'm sure they would have loved to have retracted from the things that had been written. You see, the periodicals, those were the things that they used to draw people together. But unfortunately, some of the things that they wrote down in these periodicals were things that they were trying to work through as they were trying to come out. And what's happening among many of our revisionist historians of the church today is that they're trying to go back and they're trying to say that we need to change our understanding of who a Christian really is to be more open and acceptable of all those who claim to be Christians. And here's the reason why. Those people you look up to, those great restoration leaders, they saw them on an equal basis as well. So who are you to set in judgment? Well, the truth of the matter is, I'm not their judge. But I am my judge. And I know what God's will says to me, and I know what I need to do, and I know that when God's will tells me what I need to do, I know that the gospel is a simple, simple concept that I need to wear with love and with respect. Isaiah 62, Isaiah introduced us to the idea that God was going to give a people a new name. Wonderful name. I'll tell you, a name's special. There's maybe 2 or 3 of you here in this audience that knew my granddaddy, Ralph Harp. I loved him so much. We lost him about 10 years ago. He was an elder in the Lord's church. But man, he had a unique story. When he was a little child, about 18 months old, his dad went off into World War I. He died of pneumonia on his way to France. Left his mother about 18 years old with a little boy in the 1920s, all alone. She remarried a great man. He became an elder, Brother Turner. Stonewall Turner was a great elder at South Haleville, where my home is. But there was something about that name Harp that was so special. My granddaddy loved Sanford and Son. And he said his favorite time was when old Fred Sanford said, well, my name is Sanford, period. Harp was special to him. And so he always encouraged us boys as we grew up, Harp is a special name. This morning, there is no more special name in all the world than the name that Isaiah said the Lord would give in Isaiah 62:2. The name that is revealed in Acts chapter 11, verse 28. The name Christian. That we can hold the name Christian with all that entails, with all that holds. that we can simply do Bible things in Bible ways, that we can hold to the truths, the basic truths of God's Word, and that we can speak where the Bible speaks and we remain silent where the Bible is silent. What a wonderful concept. I'm so thankful to our restoration leaders for planting some of those thoughts in our minds. Those imperfect men who had a great, great idea to take us back. We're in a time where, when I talk to people today, I'm hearing a lot of people say, well, we're non-denominational. Well, you know, non-denominational is no longer non-denominational. It's actually interdenominational that's just been given a new name. And so my dad was talking to me the other day, and he says, well, I've got a new name for us. He says, we're pre-denominational. Pre-denominational. We're behind. We want to go behind denomination. We just want to be the church that you read about in the New Testament. We want an identity. Israel was losing, had lost its identity. We need to regain our identity. We need some stand-up men and women who will say, we're going to do the work of the Lord only. We'll leave the fun and the games to the fun and games. But when it comes to God stuff, we're going to get serious. It breaks my heart when I hear about these things that some of our leaders are doing, because they're tearing apart the name I hold dear in my heart. They're tearing apart the things that's most special to me. My Christian relationship with God and the church that He purchased with His own Son's precious blood. I need to hold on to it. Sampson, special fella. But God was at work at Samson's life. He worked in so many wonderful ways in providing and helping Samson. He did some great things through Samson. And there's some things that people couldn't see, they couldn't understand, but yet God was working. God was working even when he got married to that woman from Timnah. You look over in chapter 14, you see that Samson, and here again Samson has picked up perhaps the symbolism of Israel itself when he does something in a very nonsensical way. He says Samson went down to Timnah and saw a woman of Timnah and the daughters of the Philistines. And so he went up and he told his father and mother and said, I have seen a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore get her for me as a wife. Then his father and his mother said to him, if there's no woman among the daughters of the brethren and among all my people, that you must go and get a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines. And Samson said to his father, and you know, you can almost see like a little boy laying flat on his belly with his hands pounding against the floor and his feet bouncing, get her for me. Kind of reminds you of some grocery stores you go through these days. But it also perhaps reminds you of what some brethren are doing today. Give me what I want. We've been invaded by the concept of community church. Get me what I want. Show me the things that I want to enjoy. Go into a community and say, what do you want out of a church? Well, I want something where I can have fun and games, and I can play basketball, and I can have pool, and I can have a place for my kids to go. And so we've fallen into the trap of trying to satisfy the masses when we have all that we need to satisfy the masses. We have the gospel of release from the bondage of sin that is the blessing that all men need. We've gotten to be people just like Samson. Get me this wife. I got to have it. Got 2 or 3 women, I guess, played a major role in his life. You've got the Philistine woman of Timnah in chapter 14 and verse 1. You've got the harlot of Gaza there in chapter 16 and verse 1. You've got the woman of the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah, in chapter 16 and verse 4. I think his weakness for women symbolizes man's weakness for sin. Don't you? His weakness for sin. We're all a slave to sin. Sin jumps all over us. We think we're doing so well and we get along in our work and our minds all of a sudden get snapped away from the focus of our work on things that we have no reason and no right, fellas, to even be thinking about. We look at things and we look at women and we look at our situation. We look beyond the comfort of being satisfied with what we have, and we look and we want and we want and we want, and we're not going to be satisfied until we receive. What a mistake it is for us to think that we can have our way all the time. But I think that what's so interesting about this, that even when Samson's being very, very selfish, God seems to still be very much in control. Look there in verse 4. He says, "But the father and mother did not know that it was of the Lord, that he was seeking an occasion to move against the Philistines, for all that time the Philistines had dominion over Israel." And so God was doing something, which gives me a wonderful, wonderful blessed note, is that God's will is going to prevail. God's going to take care of things. God's in control. God's in control of the things that are important to Him. God's in control of His church. He's in control of the church of Christ this morning. And even though we hear about people who are trying to wreak havoc on the sanctity and the special purity of the Lord's church, I'm here to tell you this morning, God is going to take care of His own. We may wreak havoc with it, we may destroy it, we may kick it around, we may put it in our pocket, we may use it to our liking, but at the end of the day, we don't control the church. God controls the church. Now, if I take it off into apostasy, that's my thing. It becomes my thing. It's not the Lord's anymore. But if I'm going to work within the confines of His teaching and His laws and His thoughts and His ways, then it's His church. And He's going to take care of His church. Where did Sampson get all this power? How was he able to do all those wonderful things and those powerful things, like being able to just lift the gates of a city like Gaza and be able to take it not just off its hinges and throw it off to the side? The man walked up a hill with them and he threw them down. How does a man take a fresh bone of a donkey's head, had a hard time trying to figure out what that must have looked like, and be able to sling that thing around and kill 1,000 Philistines? Was it in his hair? Or was it the power of God? I prefer to think that it was the power of God. We have 6 demonstrations of His power, of things He's able to do. But I want you to notice, look at 2 or 3 things here. Look at chapter 13 and verse 20 again. It says that, or verse 25, he says, "And the Spirit of the Lord began to move upon him at Mahanadan between Zorah and Eshtaol." Look at chapter 14 and verse 5 and 6. "And Samson went down to Timnah with the father of his mother, and came to the vineyards of Timnah." And verse 6, he said, or at the end of verse 5, "Now to his surprise, a young lion came roaring against him." Listen to verse 6. "And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him." Look down in verse 19. "Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, and he went down to Ashkelon and killed 30 of their men." Look at chapter 15 and verse 14. "Now when he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting against him. Then the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him." Where was the power? Was it in the hair? Where was the power when God said to Naaman, dip 7 times in the old filthy Jordan River? Is God in control? Oh yes, God's in control. God's taking care of His own, and He's providing. He's doing great things for Israel. He's taking them away from their oppressors. And He's staying true to His promises that He made back there in chapter 2. He's going to be there for them, and He's going to provide for them. Let's think about Delilah a minute. I don't want to miss her before our time runs out. Boy, isn't she an interesting character. There in chapter 4, or 16, verse 4, it says, afterward it happened that he, and this is a word that he just, that's kind of gets guys every time. It says, and it happened that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek whose name was Delilah. Now, it's interesting here that the Bible says that some 4 times, the Philistines had come and said, we'll pay you money. All of us are going to pay you a lot of money if you'll try to get him to tell us the secret of his strength. And so she goes to him, oh, don't you love me? Oh, yes, I love you. Well, tell me what the source of your strength is. Okay, and so he tells her a fib. She calls the Philistines in. We like to think that if that happened one time to us, we would say, okay, we figured this girl out. She's in it for the money. She don't care a thing for me. Are we that sure of ourselves when it comes to the love of a woman or the need for passion? Second time. Surely not after the second time would a person allow a woman to try to tempt you to give the secret of, knowing this is going to destroy you. 4 times. And then if you look at look at verse 15 of chapter 16, it says, after the 3rd time, she said to him, how can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You've mocked me these 3 times and have not told me where your great strength lies. You know who this is? This is the serpent at the tree. In fact, you stop and think about it, there's some great representation, symbolism in the relationship between Delilah and Sampson. God's fighting against Satan. Satan's working against God. God is going to preserve the seed. He's going to preserve His promise. He is going to preserve His ultimate reward of salvation to man. And so He works like a painstaking effort. He works through the lives of men to bring about the fulfillment of His promises. But Satan, on the other end, is trying to do everything that he possibly can to keep God from doing it. Samson is God's man to bring it about, while Delilah is Satan's woman to bring it to an end, to bring it to destruction. Satan is going to stop God dead in his tracks. And he's going to use the temptress. And then, as a part of a special way to grasp him, she's going to go to the very heart of the matter. She says, don't you love me? Where's your love for me? We say, surely he can learn from this. Surely he can learn from that foolish mistake, that foolish error. But once again, and even this last time, he finally relents and he tells her, if you cut locks of my hair, then I'll lose my strength. And you're going, man, what's wrong with you? When I was about 11 years old, my dad was preaching at the Forest Park Church of Christ in Atlanta, Georgia, and there wasn't anything such thing as a youth minister back then. We had a young couple who was the daughter of one of our elders, was married to a young man. Oh, listen, we love Jack. I was about, let's say, 11, 12 years old, and my dad was very careful about the way he allowed us to be involved with things, and he wasn't going to let me do anything with the teenagers until I turned 13 years old. Something about that teen sound to a word, to a number, before he'd let me be involved. And so I was looking forward to being able to do things with the teenagers, and so I was watching closely. In fact, I fell in love with Susan and Jack, and I never was even involved in their activities. I watched his every move. I watched what he was doing. I was so impressed with this young man who was going to do great things for the cause of Christ. And I'll never forget the night we were sitting around the table, and Dad said, "Jack and Susan are getting a divorce." Why? What? Why? Because Jack's got a girlfriend. 11-year-old boy whose greatest hero in the church was a womanizer. I see so many people who call themselves Christians who stand in this position, who proclaim the word of truth time and time again, and yet they let the sweet sound of a woman distract them from their families and from their commitments to God. We look at Sampson and we say, "You're an idiot!" And how many times have we repeated it in history? Elders and preachers and leaders. Just because we can't keep our zipper up. Excuse me, ladies. Where is your commitment? Where is my commitment? Is it not to the God of promise? Is it not to the God of covenant? Is it not to the God who says, "I'm going to be there"? Listen, the saddest verse in this text is in verse 20 of chapter 16. She said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." He awoke from his sleep and said, "I will go out before and at other times, and I'll shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. God said a long time ago, Genesis chapter 6, "I will not strive with man forever." And we know what that occasion that was leading up to. Oh, God is a patient God, and He'll be patient with me, and He'll be patient with you. But let me tell you something. Be sure your sins will find you out, and they will destroy you. You know, if we stopped right here, and I'm about to stop right here, if we stopped right here, wouldn't this be of all stories most sad? Aren't we glad that we not only have a God who doesn't tolerate sin and He will separate Himself from it, and I wish I had time to develop that some, you have to read the book, but we also have a God of remembrance. On the occasion where they plucked His eyes out and they put Him against the grain crusher in the prison, His hair began to grow back, the Bible says. Listen to what some of the people are saying on this great occasion in Dagon's temple. In verse 23, and he says, "And God," they says, "our God," talking about Dagon, they said, "our God has delivered us into the hands, Samson, our enemy." When the people saw him, they praised their God, and they said, "Our God has delivered us into our hands, and the destroyer of our land, and the one who multiplied our dead. Our God is the great God." You know, I can't help but think, but God was up there going, "I'm going to show them." But notice the heart in verse 28 of Samson. Samson's brought in. He's blind. Temple's full of men and women who hate God and everything about Him. In verse 28, Samson called on the Lord, saying, "O Lord God, remember me." I pray, strengthen me. I pray just this once, O God, that I may with one blow take vengeance on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. Just this one time. The Bible goes on to say that when he pushed those pillars off, that the temple fell, and on that day he killed more people than he ever killed in his whole lifetime. A wonderful end to a blessed story of a man who was a great, strong man, but a man who was weak in his sinfulness, in much way picturing, symbolizing who you and I really are and the way that we are. You know, we're strong when we rely on the Lord. But the story doesn't stop there. In verse 32 of Hebrews chapter 11, the Bible says, "And what more shall I say? For the time may fail me to tell of Gideon, of Barak, and Sampson." Verse 39 says, "And of all these, having obtained a good testimony through faith." Samson's recognized as a man of faith, even though he made a lot of terrible mistakes. We can do a lot of things that are wrong, but if we put our trust in God, God will remember. Thank you.